It's so good to see so many faces. I want to say, first of all, before I kind of have Abby sort of kick us off here, you do not have to have your video on if you don't want to. Zoom exhaustion is a real thing. So if you want to hide from us, you can. But Abby, I'll go ahead and hand it over to you.
Hi there, everyone. Thanks for joining. This event was supposed to be the original Buzz AIGA event where we go to a different agency every month and have drinks and get to know one another. But the original event got canceled, so we went back and forth and suggested that maybe we could do a group activity to help understand what it is MaxMedia does. So they decided to walk us through their UX process, and we're going to have some breakout rooms so that it can be a little more activity centric instead of just like boring lecture style. So I think we'll get started in a couple minutes. It's only 5 minutes in, and I'm sure a couple people will be a little late, but we're excited.
Hey, Rachel, do you want to talk about like MaxMedia or what we're looking for, or do you want to wait till more people join? Or
yeah, I was just gonna say, Abby, do you want me to wait a little bit longer for more people, or do you want us to go ahead?
You could you might as well just start telling about yourself before we start like really the educational part.
Okay, cool. Sounds good. So hello, everyone. My name is Rachel Kraus. I work for MaxMedia. I'm the employee experience manager there, so not a designer, a little bit of a fish out of water here, but I'm happy to be here. So just a couple of notes about MaxMedia and who we are. We're a small experience design consultancy here in Atlanta. We've existed for 20 plus years, and our warehouse is on the west side, but now our office is kind of everywhere, as I'm sure yours are as well. So we sort of service companies from startups to Fortune 50s, doing in-house design and development, all the way from enterprise to marketing and promotional materials. So we have a couple of team members here with us tonight. Our two presenters are Michelle Morgan, if you want to give a little wave. She's a senior UX designer, and then Lisa Plato, who's a UX designer, if you want to give a little wave. And then we also have Greg Vagan here. He is our creative director extraordinaire. We are missing our executive design director, JD Jordan, who really wanted to be here, but he is feeling sickly. But I know that you guys, some of you might know him, and so he'd appreciate all the love. He's so bummed he can't be here. So I do want to take a quick minute to say that MaxMedia is hiring. We are looking for some people to fill roles for 2021. On our website, we do have a couple of job postings. And mostly what we like to do is we like to have folks join our talent pool. Since we're a consultancy, we move really quickly when we hire. And so it's good to have folks kind of already in the pipeline. So if that interests you, we'd love to get to know you. I'd love for you to check out those job postings. And in the chat, I am going to quickly paste our careers page and then my email if you want to reach out. Boop, there it is. All right, so with that said, just a couple of notes on how we're gonna be interacting tonight. So Michelle and Lisa are going to lead us through kind of the madness that was making a process out of things. And so as you listen tonight, please utilize the chat if you have any questions. We will have time for questions at the end. And so if you want a question to be answered at the end, please put it in the chat and we'll try to remember it for later. Please feel free to respond with emojis. Whenever I'm presenting, I love to see like nods and emojis. And so I'm sure Michelle and Lisa will appreciate that as well. So feel free to get creative with those little guys. And then make sure that you're on mute. You're all doing a great job at that. We will have time for questions, like I said, at the end. And then a little bit later on, we're going to do breakout rooms as well. So without further ado, I will hand it off to Michelle and Lisa.
Hi, I want to, while I'm setting this up, I'll ask Lisa if she'll introduce herself and tell you a little bit about her background.
Hi, I am Lisa Plato, and I work for MaxMedia. I am a UX designer with a graphic design background. And I badgered JD so many times that he finally hired me. And now I've been at MaxMedia for several years. So don't give up. That would be my first bit of advice. But yeah, so now I'm embedded in MaxMedia and they can't get rid of me like a virus or a pandemic. And yeah, and so then Michelle came on and we worked on a project together, and we've been thinking about like how we work together and how can we work together better, because it was a bumpy road. You tell me if I'm explaining this right, Michelle, but it wasn't easy. So
I think, so Lisa and I both came into the office at a point in time when the office was in kind of a major reboot phase. And then in addition to that, we also come from really different backgrounds and we have really different personalities. Lisa's very outgoing and extroverted. I'm very quiet and introverted and can be very, pinched during the day and stuff like that because I'm concentrating, and so there were a lot of things where we had a lot of conflict early on. But I think, we worked together on a project for about a year. And one of the things that happens when you work together that long is that you really start asking yourself at the end of every day, like, I really like this person. She's really fun. I like hanging out with her. I like working with her. How can we get better at this? What does my teammate do right that I can learn from? What can I share? What are the things where I need to move closer to how she operates? And what are things that I could make some suggestions? So this is a lot, it's very similar to the way we look at things for our clients. And so in general, Lisa and I were doing this on our project, but at the same time, the entire office was saying, hey, how can we be better at this entire thing? Why not take this process that we apply to our clients where we dig into how they do things and apply that to ourselves? So we had a couple of reasons. We're experts and it's in our best interest to invest that expertise in our own stuff as well as in our clients. And we evangelize about how this kind of work should and does make everything better through alignment. So we kind of think it helps if you have lived through achieving that type of alignment with your own coworkers. This is kind of another version of what we all call empathy in the UX world. And then, and then the third thing is we had some issues and we thought that taking a closer, more systematic approach would benefit our teams, our clients, and at the end of the day, our bottom line. So those first two things about applying your own expertise and empathy, I think everybody can really agree with. It's this third thing where it gets really interesting. So I have found in every office I've ever worked in that the things that go smoothly and go well tend to be really similar. And it's just like this fantastic quote from Leo Tolstoy about happy families are all alike and unhappy families have a uniqueness to them. And within the office context, what this presents as is, standard operating procedure and the place where things run smoothly is often really similar from office to office. The parts where you see dysfunction tend to be really unique, and they're kind of intersections of great and terrible things that are specific to that office. I could sort of list off like, this is the thing from the first office I worked in, and this is the thing from the second office, and stuff like that. But that dysfunction is distinctive to each office. So at MaxMedia, we've got this really good culture and really good clients, and we've got a shared goal around really good work. But we were experiencing some inefficiencies, and they were annoying, and they would cause these kind of blow-ups in the office. I'm sure everybody's been in one or around one. They're very uncomfortable. And they were costing us money. And so we looked around the table and we thought, hey, we're all smart and we're hardworking, and we could tell that we could do better as a team. Um, and so we really said, okay, we could sit around and make a list of what we think is wrong, but we all know that the way we normally start this is the UX team says, hey, let's talk to every single person and ask everybody a similar set of questions. And so we did that. We took our full stakeholder interview process and our full UX process, interviews, affinity mapping, priority poker, competitive research. We even, as an entire office, every single one of us took these 4 personality tests, and it brought up a lot of things that we were able to start to see things more clearly, and to roll that work up into work across several teams across our whole company. So I did just want to show you a little.
Okay, let's start.
This is our post-it note process and the tail end of it.
That's Rachel.
So that is the last post-it note. I think in total we had something like 3,600 post-it notes that came out of the process. And so this was a sorting process that took, what, 6 of us, Lisa?
Oh my gosh. It was more than weeks, and it was more than people that I can possibly tell you.
It was crazy. And we were trying to do it over the holidays, you know, when people wanted to do all kinds of different things. But at the end of the day, we sorted all these post-it notes and we came up with, I think we probably came up with 30 or so things that we could do. And then we brought it to the table and said, okay, everybody has to vote because we only have so many resources. We only have so much time. What is it that we think is important? And we created a roadmap. And I apologize for it saying 2024 on this slide. I ripped this from one of my clients' 5-year roadmaps. But we created some internal projects that started out with us defining, we've been through this reboot stage. We know who we are. Let's figure out how we want to say who we are. Through content strategy, a redesigned website, a new business development strategy that focused in on who our ideal client was, and some more targeted strategy for business development, collateral for all of those things. You heard Rachel talking at the beginning, and she has been a crucial piece of making sure that we have a culture of support for all of this change and to make sure we still want to talk to each other after it's all done. And then finally, the thing that we're going to talk about tonight, which is a retooled office process. So we identified this as the place where, you know, all these other things we could refocus, we could shift our attention, things like that. But this was the place where we felt like we could improve our day-to-day life by making things easier, more consistent, and building confidence into our delivery process. So in this process, there were a few things that we learned that have kind of nothing to do specifically with process, but they're the types of things that can support or undermine it. So the first thing that we learned across the board in those, you know, hundreds of and essentially thousands of post-it notes that we had were that we liked and we respected the members of our team. We wanted to spend time together. We wanted to accomplish things together. We were all ambitious in our goals and thought that we had an enormous amount of capacity and could really deliver on a lot of things. And we were more interested in doing good work than in doing a specific type of work. And finally, we had a shared understanding of where the frustration existed. It looked different from different point of views. A project manager might call it out as one thing, and a UX designer or a visual designer or even the exec team might call it out as something different. But when we really sat down and said, like, okay, here's how people are saying it, it is really all the same things. And so we boiled it down into a couple of really simple things. We all knew we needed to improve the structure that we operated in. We needed more clearly defined goals in that range. Design was doing some PM work. Tech needed better handoffs from design. We had some clients that weren't keeping track of their own decisions. Not a client, it was a few clients that were doing that. And so we knew if we could start to understand better how each team person's role was defined and how those roles affected each other, we could streamline our process and progress more efficiently through the projects. The goals really had to do with, are we starting something with the end in mind? Are we all clear about what that end is and how that works? And then finally, standard and special kind of fit together, but the gist of it is, if we say, this is the standard process, and I understand what that means, and I understand how to talk to a client about that, how to talk to, how to listen to what the client's saying, to hear that they understand me. I understand that that's a particular strategy. We're going to apply it in a particular way. We're going to price it in a particular way. We're going to staff it in a particular way. And, you know, none of these things are super sexy, but they take forever when you start reinventing the wheel every time. And so the great thing,
Michelle, if I could just interject, like as a designer, we don't do that. We just like, we fly by the seat of our pants, but it's like, can we just think about it in a different way? Like, I love the idea of breaking it down, like, you know, this thing is happening. So like, how can I think about it in a more structured way, which I wouldn't normally do as a designer. So.
and Lisa brings up a really good point. I think that oftentimes when we say standard as a designer, what we hear is basic. And that is not at all what a standard design process is. And we'll talk about this a little bit later when we show you our first stab at the UX process. When we looked at the standard process, it was actually, there were things that we weren't doing that we really needed to remember to add back in. But the great thing about having that standard process clearly defined is that from the very beginning, in that very first conversation with the client, you can sort of mentally catalog really quickly, well, that's typical, that's typical, that's typical, that's special, right? That right there, they're talking about something that's really special. And we think about this a lot with how the dev team works and building custom things, but we don't always think about it. We always think about every single design as, you know, well, this is bespoke, right? But the process is not. And so having that cue of, oh, you want something unusual, you want something special. And it's not unusual from the design standpoint, it's unusual from the process standpoint. Well, that is going to cost you a little bit more, or I at least know it's going to be a little bit different. So once you have this in place, it also has sort of collateral effects in that it helps you onboard new people and junior people. They have a point of reference to get oriented, to ask questions. And instead of having a sense that they didn't know something, like sort of a vague sense, it's a little bit more of a sense of there are, instead of it being unknowns, like I just didn't know that I didn't know, right? It moves more over into a territory of, oh, there's this thing that somebody told me about because it's on this piece of paper or this in this document, or somebody laid out the process for me. And I haven't done that before, but I know that in advance because I've been given this roadmap for how I'm going to do this work. It helps you create that more detailed, more standard project strategy. And then the overview of the roles and responsibilities throughout the process will better inform the resources that you need for the execution of the project. We can start to see how our roles intersect, and that helps us select the right tools for sharing our work and communicating. And then having clearly defined goals keeps us focused and not second guessing what the expectations are. And finally, that clear standardized process, and I know I said this before, but you really can't say it enough, it really helps us understand what is typical. And that means we can spend our time and energy figuring out what is new and different and meeting the challenge with all of our energy instead of sort of worn out from the day-to-day stuff that should be really easy. Okay, so we're going to talk about how we did the process map. And the first thing I want to sort of, probably should have caveated the whole presentation with this. This is a work in process. This is not a finished product. And this is not something where we say like, okay, we're done, and then we put it away. It's our expectation that we will continue to evolve this, but you're going to see some things that are maybe a little, I would never present this level of messiness to a client, but I feel like, you know, these are peers. And so we want to show you how it happened.
I think to Greg's point earlier was like, it's an iterative process, right? So we're iterating just like we do in UX design. We iterate. So
Yes.
it's always going to be a work in process.
So the thing that bubbled up was we kept hearing that we had project issues. We had, feedback issues and SOW issues and workflow, but it turned out they were really process issues. And so that's sort of where all of this came from. And then this is really how we started. This is a wall in our office. And
don't be scared.
that is actually blue painter's tape that you see that is sort of, boxing off some things, not super well. There are some instructions that one of our coworkers included at the beginning of this. There are Post-it notes. The writing is messy. But, we had a lot of really talented people on our team, and we knew that we were doing a lot of things that were really smart and fantastic. You can kind of see in the left-hand third of the screen, there's a turquoise Post-it note or a teal Post-it note that says customer journey. There's a customer journey sitting directly under that, and then there's another one down the board from that, and then there's another one that's down the board from that that's actually a project, the project Lisa and I worked on, that we kind of flipped the customer journey on its head. It was an internal portal, and we said it's not the person that matters as much here, it's actually the data inside the portal. And so we wound up drawing a data journey instead of a customer journey. And so we were like, okay, we have all these fantastic ways that we do this, but we're not necessarily connecting one thing to another. And we're not necessarily connecting what's happening with the user stories from a design team to the user stories on the dev team. And it's not that they're a one-to-one fit, but there is a lot of connection. So after we got everything up on the wall, we realized that one of the toughest things was going to be, okay, how do we move forward from this? How do we take this, beautiful mess with all of this fantastic information that's on the wall and pull it into something that we can really work from and that feels, not everybody in our office is as comfortable with the whiteboard as I might be, and with the sort of messiness and things like that. And so we took a minute and said, okay, if this was our client, how would we be showing this to them? What would we be doing? And can we use kind of a standard kind of service plan documentation process with a nicely developed legend? So we've got up at the top of this sheet in purple is where our client sits. And then we have the swim lane or the lane of interaction that's happening between the client and the company. We start with the black is exec. The gray, I believe, is finance and human resources. The blue are the project managers. And we work our way down through design, dev, QA. And then honestly, I can't remember what the last one is. Oh, the pink one is finance.
Just to interject though, it depends on the client, because sometimes they need it spelled out, and sometimes that it can look like this. I mean, sometimes, we are very flexible, I guess, in how we present things to people, but mostly it's like this would be perfect to show them.
Yeah, so we started taking what was on the wall and looking at like, okay, what are the pieces of the framework that we know are informed? We worked out our phases, we worked out our lanes of interaction, all that kind of stuff. And then we said, okay, what happens when we try to pull the stuff on the wall into this? And I kind of stupidly thought, oh, it'll go like that and we'll be done and it'll be really great. This is just like a drawing exercise, right? But one of the things about what was on the wall is that we had used all the teams together to put it on the wall. And as we started to get around the table, the comment everybody said was, well, that's really great for a first draft, but it's been a little while since I put that up there, and I've got these 17,000 other things that I've thought about. And in addition to that, I think Lisa and I had gone around the office, and in every casual conversation we had, we kept saying, like, you should be keeping a list of stuff that annoys you about about how your team works or how you work, or, and so people were like, hey, I'm armed and dangerous. I've got my list of annoyances. And we were like, okay, we have really like opened a can of worms here. So it evolved into this. We had to kind of pull our framework apart. You can see from the Post-it notes that design is on the top. We've also inserted a process, which is as of yet completely blank, that's around BA. We have employee engagement, we've got dev, we've got QA, PM, and then finally our communications and content piece, where we're talking a lot about what's happening in these projects to the outside world. We're not showing up with the exec team and our decision-making process around that, and the places where the finance team fits in have not made it onto the map yet. So that's kind of the first piece of it. But I do want to zoom in for just, actually, let me go back. So there are a couple things about this map, and before we kind of zoom in and show you a little bit more detail, I do want to talk about the overall process and some of the things that we kind of came to conclusions about. We had to define who was driving what part of the process. And I think this is a place where lots of times you can kind of get a lot of breakdown. I mentioned earlier that one of the things that we brought up to initiate this project was that design was doing some PM work. There were some differences in language between the design team and the dev team. So we might be in the classic way that one of our corporate clients does it, we might be using exactly the same word in two totally different ways. So there were a lot of those things. But we noticed that specific parts of the process would require a very particular mindset. So we had to know, like, who's driving the bus right here? Because if I'm the person in charge of making the decision, or it's my team or the design team that is driving this part of the process, the mindset that we apply to it is going to be very different than if it's the PM team or the product team or the exec team, and understanding where you fit in that chart. And we talk to our clients about, like, hey, can you provide us a racy chart of, responsible, accountable, consulted, informed, but taking a minute to say, okay, when we're at this phase of the process, I'm really just informed. I'm no longer responsible for this. I'm no longer the person who's accountable. And that means I have to come to it listening very intently for red flags and gaps, but I'm not the person who's deciding the direction of where it is that we're going for this part of the process. And so I have to play a really different role. And I have to come into that conversation prepared in a different way than I would otherwise. Also, handoffs are so crucial. And we have not gotten to the point where we're actually documenting handoffs, but we're talking about it a lot. And so we've already initiated some things, but one of the particular things about our office is everybody is so nice and everybody likes each other so much. But we were being too nice and too accommodating in the handoff process. And by doing that, we were not getting the best handoff, and we weren't getting sort of a rejection process built into it, where a team could say, Michelle, this is not telling me what I need to know so that I can build this. So the dev team wasn't rejecting our work. We were not necessarily getting, we were getting some pretty sort of subpar user stories from one of our clients at the time. Lisa and I were not rejecting those back to the PM with a quick list of, like, hey, can you fill in the blanks on this Swiss cheese of a user story or user scenario that the client gave?
I think there was a weird back and forth. Like, it was like the client's not giving us the right user story, and then we're not passing on the right user story. So it's like, where's the gap in that?
Yeah, right.
It was horrifying.
And how do we start to, Lisa and I created something that looked more like a sort of Mad Libs process for the client, because we finally felt like we had permission to say, okay, we've taken your user story and pulled it apart. And so here's the stuff that's about the business requirements, but it's got some gaps. Here's the stuff that's about your resources that are allocated to this, This also has some gaps. And then here's your actual user story written out by role and activity and goal. And you've really only included goal.
I think that's a really good point, Michelle. It's like, can we not just ask the client, like, this is what I need?
Yeah.
Like, how can I reach out to that client and say, like, this is, like, you want this product, but I need this information. Like, I can't do this job without this information. So we're like flying blind. Anyway, go ahead.
Is it okay if we ask questions in the middle, or should we do it at the end?
If you've got something, absolutely, we can
What
stop.
are we looking at? That's what I am trying to understand. Is this a timeline, or is it like your project management page?
So this is, that is a great question. And I'm sorry, that is not totally clear. Let me zoom in just a little bit.
And also, what is QA, BA? I assume PM is project manager.
Yes. So QA is quality assurance, BA is business analysis. And so that's where you're bumping up against the actual sort of, we talk a lot about the user requirements, but we don't talk as much about the business requirements.
Got it.
You can never ask a dumb acronym question to us because we have been beaten down with acronyms. Like, I'll probably die with an acronym on my gravestone. That's all I have.
Thank you.
And then in terms of what we're looking at right now, so I just want to give everybody a quick orientation. Sorry if this was not clear. So each of the horizontal gray lines that you can see, and they have the little black dots on them. So each of those is a lane, and it's associated with a team that we have in the office. So all the way over on the left-hand side of the screen, you can see the yellow Post-it notes that are indicating the teams. So where it says WIP means work in progress for design, which is basically like, hey, this is up here. Don't tell me it's incomplete. I know it's incomplete, right? And then below that, it says MM, insert the BA process. So I'm MM, and this just got put on there maybe 2 weeks ago. Like, hey, we're gonna need a BA process. You can see where it says dev, and then there's a black box, and we're gonna kind of zoom in and show you a little bit about the dev work, because we're gonna dive all the way into the UX piece of it in just a second. Let's see.
This tool is Miro, or tell me I'm saying it wrong, Michelle. Miro. I have a vowel problem, but it's Miro. If you guys haven't used Miro, please do, because it is awesome and we love it. And it's a great way for us to work together and work on projects together. And we can leave each other notes, or we can get on there and just, I don't know, move things around. It's awesome.
So we just kind of zoomed into a little piece of the technology team. So I wanted to show you this, and it's, again, this is still a work in process, right? So what the technology team has done is gone in, and they are yellow. So where you see the yellow rectangles that are more horizontal, you can see 4 of them in a row at the very beginning of their chart. These are their activities. And then remember, blue is PM and pink is finance. And you see 2 different indications of pink. So one is the box that's sitting above the line. So this is a step in the process where dev is actually communicating directly with our CFO about something associated with the project. And then below the line, you're seeing some gold highlighted writing and some pink, red highlighted writing. So the gold are gain points. These are things that are going really well. And the other ones are pain points. So this is where the dev team's like, oh my God, I'm losing my mind. We've got to fix this. And then you see a smattering of other things. So the yellow squares with the black boxes around them, and the green squares with the black boxes around them, and all the little notes that are associated with those at the bottom of the page, just above where it says pipeline and new business pitch and estimating and SOW. These are the UX team sitting down with the dev team and saying like, okay, I see that you have some things on here, but we need to push it forward. Talk me through what is happening in your team. Talk me through where you're seeing different things and different types of projects and how they're landing on this. As an agency, we do a pretty wide variety of work as opposed to sort of enterprise work, which has a much more consistent process. And so one of the things we're trying to do is to say, this type of client is our core, and it's what we're aiming for. And this type of process is core to us, and that's what we're aiming for. And so, you know, this will obviously get more and more filled out. I think one of the things that's been interesting for me is it comes so naturally to the design team to think in this way. So when you see ours in just a second, you'll be like, wow, there's a lot more stuff on here. But it's helping me understand some of the point of view of my coworkers and what they don't get about what the design team does, and especially the UX part of the design team, that this is not something that comes naturally to them. And we've, you know, had multiple conversations trying to say, like, just make a list on a piece of paper, or just give me a set of Post-it notes, or just put it in this Miro board, or and they're getting it, you know, but this is so normal and so crucial to how we work and not to how they work. So in addition to it helping me kind of understand what goes on in their process, it also is helping me understand what they don't get about what we do, and what we're sometimes presenting to the client that they don't see. The other thing we've done is, within all of this, we know there's a catalog of tools that we are using. And some of those are really clearly defined and we know exactly what they are, and some of them are not. Some of them are things that are gaps in what we're doing, or we're looking at changing them out. And so we took a minute and stepped back and said, okay, based on everything we know so far about all the disciplines involved, can we come up with a parts catalog of all the tools that are used in this process? And just making sure that we know everything that we're using. We're thinking about places where there might be duplication, and then also considering budget. You know, one of the big reasons we undertook this was about efficiency and making sure that we're profitable. And so we want to continue to do that in a couple different ways. Okay, so since we're the UX team, we're going to take a little deeper, closer look into the UX part of the process, and we'll talk about how we got started there. We did something that was a little bit different than the other teams. We had all this interview data, and we have our very dependable research process, but we still needed something to kind of bring it together. And so after going in circles for a little while, we decided to use an existing framework. And we did this, you know, for a lot of different reasons, but not the least of which was, for anybody out there who's working in an agency, the pace can be really fast. A lot of your process can be dictated by what the client thinks your process should be, and trying to be accommodating to the client. And so we were like, hey, we need to take a step back and make sure that we are looking at the whole of the process. We didn't want to leave out any steps. And we also were having kind of a struggle starting from nothing in terms of mapping a specific US process and making it more detailed. And then I think one of the great things that came out of this is that it also neutralized it. It was not me saying, here's my process, what do you think, Lisa? And Lisa criticizing my process or thinking like, well, I don't want to say that.
Never do that.
I like Michelle, right? And it wasn't the two of us ganging up on Ken about his process. It was a complete third party. And it's something we had all seen out there and had all referenced in one way or another. And so we knew we liked this. We thought it was relatively complete. But it gave us something neutral, and we could kind of tear it apart, and it didn't feel like we were talking about each other in that way. We weren't kind of like criticizing each other in the process.
Yeah. And you know what I like about it is, like, we can pick and choose. Like, depending on the client, it's going to be like, I want to use this and I want to use that, depending on what the client's needs are. So it gave us choices.
Exactly. And so the first thing we did was we took that process and we put it down on a piece of paper in Miro. And we had, you can see in these sort of darker green boxes, the competitive analysis, the data analysis, the user feedback, things like that. These are all things that existed in that other process. And then we said, okay, there's some stuff we automatically know that we do that is similar, but it's not listed out in this process. So we started adding in these kind of lighter green boxes, and then looking at this full breadth of it and taking their notes and starting to combine them with our notes. And then especially as we got to the end of it, where it was like, oh, now we have to present this to the client. We have to get feedback. We have to look at the client's changes. We have to think about sign off. We are going to look at how we finalize our style guide or how we implement their style guide into our work. And then what happens when we shift over into the QA piece of it, where we're assigning that role, making sure we're transferring our user stories over to them, all of that kind of stuff. So that was sort of our first step, was the basic process, and then we started adding to it. And then we went crazy. We all sat down in a meeting together and said, okay, let's really take a look at this and start to add in our experience as we're having it right now today. What is it that's going on? And so this really simple, elegant process, you can see we started to add notes to it. We started to say the order that these things happen in is really not the order that we do them in. We're not starting with a style guide. And so we start to look at visual design in a different order, and then our approval process on the wireframes shifts over to the approval process on the visual design. So we have multiple points where there's client sign off and multiple points where there is an actual sort of buttoning up of the work and a handing off to a different team, and how we go back and forth with the dev team on those things. And then you can see these sort of big swooping lines, and then some places you can see the green box up at the top over in the right hand side. This is IA. This was something that was much farther down the road in the original process. But because we sort of looked at this from this really neutral point of view, we were like, no, that happens a lot earlier for us. We think about these frameworks and these structures when we're starting our brainstorming and sketching, and maybe even prior to that. And then we started pulling in specific sentiments. We have one team member who is operating inside one of our larger clients as a staff augmentation. And that's where all process falls apart. They have their own culture, they have their own process. But there's this conflict because they're buying what it is we do as an agency. And some of that is tied to how agencies operate, but they want it delivered inside their framework as a Fortune 10 company or something. I don't know, they're somewhere in the top 100.
I feel maybe this seems like overwhelming or like it's complicated, but it's really not. You're just breaking it down into pieces, and it's not as complicated as it looks. There's a lot of different colors and there's a lot of different pieces, but it helps you make sense of a process. So I don't know how to explain that better, Michelle, but it doesn't, just because it looks complicated doesn't mean that it is complicated. Like, I don't know how to say that better.
I think I get what you're trying to say. I think where we are in the process, it looks a little messy and it looks a little complicated. And I think the reason we wanted to show it to people in this way is we did not want to land in this meeting with this fully baked process and say like, hey, here it is, it's beautiful. We want everybody to understand, like, if you start doing this, if you start implementing this in your own work or in a small team or your agency or wherever it is that you are, it is going to look less organized before it looks more organized. And that can be a really intimidating part of the process.
That helps.
So we wanted to talk about a couple things that we learned, or that we have learned so far. And then we want to talk to you about the fact that we know it's going to take us forever to do this. And so we wanted to peel off a couple of projects because we want to get some bang for our buck and not get completely exhausted by the process. So we're going to start with the good. And I think we're going to ask you guys to do a little bit of an exercise in the breakout where you talk about some of these things in your own organizations. Like, where are you really getting it right? And then what are the things, sort of the way Lisa and I asked our coworkers, like, what are the things that are driving you crazy that you're like, can't we solve this, right? So the places that we looked at and we were like, oh, this is going so well. We have an extended sprint zero is what we call it. And this may be something people do all over the place, but this is our research and discovery phase. It tends to be somewhere between 3 and 5 weeks, which is a little bit longer than a normal sprint. We have figured out how to use this in a way that the client actually likes watching us do the discovery side of it. Because we've made it very approachable. It's very much workshop based. We're asking them questions that oftentimes they're like, oh, nobody's really asked me that before. We have a freight company that we got into an extended conversation in one of our workshops about the actual financial model that sits underneath what they do. And at the end of it, one of the guys in the room said, I thought you guys were designers. And it's like, well, we are, but like, I'm really good at math and I want to understand what's happening on the math side of your business because I don't want to dismantle it in the process of redesigning your entire customer experience. And so we use this piece of it, the Sprint Zero, to sharpen the project definition and to get the client to talk about us about their gaps in understanding and to talk more about their sort of large scale strategic goals. Do they have a 5-year roadmap? Do they have a technology debt investment program? What is it that's happening? The second thing is we figured out how to use the documentation process simultaneously for ourselves and the client so that we could eliminate an entire step of work that we were doing. And we could also at the same time make sure that the client was getting documentation that they could review instead of having to tell us, you walk out of a sprint presentation oftentimes and somewhere between 60 and 80% of what you presented actually gets approved. And this can be one of those really messy things where you take your presentation and it's agency or maybe fast and you say, oh, this got approved and this got approved and this got approved, and somebody makes a note of it somewhere. But our client kept kind of going back over old ground. And so Lisa came up with a way to create a documentation deck that said, okay, or I think we actually call it the approval deck. It looks totally different than the presentation deck. It has a different cover. It's dated. It has instructions on the cover of it that say, review this for this purpose. Tell us if this is incorrect. It's really simple. It's very straightforward. I know when we were talking about doing it, both of us were like, is it really this easy? Is it really this simple? The client loves it. They love having it. They've actually said that they use the presentation decks for all kinds of things for internal conversations, but that the reference of the approval deck is fantastic for them. And then finally, we are a team that loves continuous improvement. We are all inherently iterative thinkers. We sort of operate from the start where you are, use what you have, do what you can, think about the rest of it tomorrow. And the sprint retros that we do are fantastic at generating insights into places we can improve that are very tactical and at the same time very strategic. We were not necessarily connecting the dots between, okay, we came up with this great idea and we thought about how to do it, and then we actually have to implement it. We have to put it in the process. But the sprint retros were great, and we knew that we could build on that culture. Now, where we were not killing it. And these are kind of, this is where we really have to lean on that idea of the iterative culture. We can't address.
It's cringy. I don't like it.
We can't address everything at once, and this is a place where we have to say, we have to gracefully kind of accept our issues and and know that tomorrow is another day. We will improve them. But there were a lot of things in our communication, especially between the design team and the dev team, where we had a structure and an intention about what needed to happen, and that was not getting communicated. And it was as simple as the dev team was telling us, like, well, this doesn't explain this to me, and this doesn't show this, and different things like that. And we were like, okay, but we have definitely thought about all these things. And so, how are we kind of missing out on this? And we realized that there were a lot of sketches that we had, and when we finally showed them to the dev team, they were like, oh my God, these are great. You're showing me the original framework and the diagrammatic concept of what it is that I'm trying to build. And Bear, who's our lovely developer that we were working with at the time, said, you hand me your designs and I go to my desk and I sketch out how, and he showed us his diagram and our diagram. And we were like, oh, we're drawing the same thing. If we just gave you our diagram, that would be so much easier, which he agreed with. It also meant that we needed to take a look at the way this happened is Lisa and I showed Bear this giant whiteboard that just happened to still be hanging out from where we had originally diagrammed a piece of work. And it was getting handed off to Deb, and we still had the whiteboard. And there were all of these notes all over the whiteboard. And it was like, oh, we have annotated our final design, but there's information in those original annotations that is not making it all the way through, in the same way that the diagrammatic communication was not always making it all the way through.
Yeah.
And so we implemented a process of annotations start at the beginning. This is not something that you come and do at the end. It also had the added benefit of saving us a lot of time, because annotations are no longer that long, laborious process of like, oh, right, oh, right, this, oh, right, that, that nobody really likes doing. We are good at patterns, and we are good at efficiencies in the design, but we were not necessarily great at extracting, just like sort of communicating the intent. We were not good at extracting the diagrammatic concept and then making it where everybody on the team understood how different pieces were connected in that way. So where Lisa and I might be reusing something, the dev team was under the impression, oh, these visually look the same, great, so my styling is the same. But in all actuality, it was operating in the same way too. The underlying piece of work was happening in the same way from a back-end perspective. And so we had to figure out how to start communicating those things. And then I talked earlier about the feedback loops. We had to give design away and give them permission to push stories back. And the way that we did that was we essentially asked other people to push back on us. And then once, everybody saw us very happily taking that pushback, it was a little bit easier for us to say, like, hey, I'm going to need to push this back to you, right? And so you get a little bit less resistance when you allow people to do it to you first.
Really funny too, because I didn't even realize there was a communication gap until you were like, you can ask more questions. You don't have to. Like, I don't know why there was this weird part of me that was like, okay, development's telling me something and I have to accept it. Like, why don't I just ask them a question back? Like, it'll help me like realize, like, I can't, there's a back and forth, I guess, is what I would say.
Yeah, and there's a lot of times when what you really need to do is to say to somebody like, hey, you're talking to me about something that's kind of, outside my purview. And
yeah.
I need to take a minute to repeat it back to you to make sure I've understood what you said.
Oh my gosh. Particularly when you're working with a large corporation that uses a lot of acronyms and you just don't understand what those acronyms mean. I think that that's a perfect time to ask a question. So, yes.
Yeah.
Heard.
So we are in no way. Oh, sorry.
Before you move on, Brady asked a question in the chat that has to do with our Sprint Zero, and Greg did answer in the chat, but I thought that before you move on, it would be a good thing to answer. Greg answered in the chat, but I'd like to hear from you as well. Brady, do you want to ask your question again?
Yeah, I was just wondering what the deliverable for Sprint Zero was that you handed off to the clients. Like, what did that look like?
Yeah, so it tends to vary a little bit more widely than our other deliverables because we take a little bit of time to figure out, okay, what is it we're hearing? And so how do we need to say that back to the client to make sure we understood it? So we have done, I mentioned the data journey that we produced where we said, okay, it's not a customer journey. It's actually sort of how does the data move through all these different systems and processes. We've created that. We've created UI flow diagrams that try to start to say like, okay, we have a platform and we hear that it's role-based and we hear that everybody needs a dashboard and every dashboard has a slightly different personality. Can we start to diagrammatically represent that with UI cards? We do give them oftentimes actual customer and stakeholder sentiments that are rolled up into some gap analysis. And then I'm trying to think if there's anything, we do kind of 5-year roadmaps. If we hear a customer talking about it, and then we'll sort of situate our project in that 5-year roadmap. So there's a project I'm working on right now that's a journey mapping, sort of an intensive journey mapping project. And the client had originally come to us and said, we need a new website, both pre and post login to answer our customer needs. And we said, okay, great. And so when we started describing the website, we showed a roadmap that showed some journey mapping happening prior to the website design and some branding work happening prior to that. It's not something they had talked to us about, but we knew it was a need. And it was inside a sort of line of about 7 or 8 big projects for that client. And we said, and you know, here's what you've tasked us with doing. So we want you to see how that fits into this grand scheme of things that need to happen. Well, we ended up with the journey mapping work and the branding work and the website and 5 or 6 other things that we had sort of put on the page together, just by contextualizing the work that they were asking us for. So that's a lot of what it is we're asking a question. Oh, you want that? Okay, well, tell me some things that are happening around that. And then we're trying to create some type of visualization that represents that context.
If I could just interject, Michelle, is like something I've learned from Michelle is that it can be messy and it can be weird, but you just throw everything at the wall. So everything that your client or whatever's happening, just put it on the wall and then go back and like piece it all together. So
Yeah.
That's almost what we do, isn't it, right, Michelle? Like people tell us stuff and we are like putting it on the wall and we are like crazy people. And then it's like, how does this all fit together? And we try to figure it out later.
Well, and you try in the Sprint Zero piece of it to say, here's everything I told you, and here's everything I know that's associated with what you told me. And then you try in the course of the project to say, okay, now we have to connect the dots between these things. And in addition to that, we have to understand your constraints to narrow down the focus of what we're actually producing. Because, you know, the client will tell you, hey, I want all this stuff. I want the world. And you have to say, okay, you've told me you want the world. You've also told me you want to spend a certain amount of money. So let's talk about what a functional, you know, a lot of people call it an MVP, but clients are oftentimes past that when they get to us. So it's like, let's talk about what a functional product looks like that meets your needs and sits inside your constraints and fits your
and I would also add, like, do you feel like, this is a question for you, Michelle, it's like, do you feel like we're trying to understand their business or where they're coming from, or like,
yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, okay, so let's, for instance, Mako. or driven brands. Like we're talking about cars. So then does that change how I'm visualizing this?
Yeah, and
I'm
I
not trying to put
think,
you on the spot. I'm just
well, I think understanding the, you know, we have some clients that everything they do is service oriented, and we have some clients that everything they do is a physical action.
okay.
We work with some freight companies. They're moving physical things from one place to another, right? And so understanding that process and how it lands on your client and what that means about the approach they take to their own work, especially in that early stage, and getting them to describe more about how they think about their work and how they get it done, what their real goal is as a person, what they feel like their purpose is, all of those things, they end up coming into our Sprint Zero. And we try to find a visually consistent way to represent all of those things back to the client to make sure we got it right. And we're waiting for them to tell us, like, hey, there's a lot of interesting stuff here, but this is not right. Like, and that's where the conversation opens up, and it's like, okay, well, tell me more about it. Let's unpack it together. Brady, does that answer your question? That's not a, we can send you something that's a Sprint Zero deck.
No, you don't have to do that. No, it definitely answered my question.
Yeah,
it does remind me of the wrong user interface though, Michelle, for the
yeah, so that, and that is one of our theories about the Sprint Zero information is our job is not to tell you the answer, it is to represent what we think we heard. So one of the guys in our dev team said to Lisa and I one time, if you want the answer to a question and you don't ask, like if you go into a chat room, I might be dating myself, but if you go into some type of digital forum and you say, hey, what's the answer to this? No one will answer your question, right? Nobody cares. But if you go in and you post the wrong answer, people will jump on it. And they can't wait to tell you, like, that's wrong, this is right. And so we kind of came up with this internal joke about, my job is not to walk into the meeting and tell you what the right answer is. My job is to walk into the meeting and represent where our thinking is so that you can tell me where it's wrong, right? And so I'm just showing up as a wrong answer interface. So I'm actually excited when you tell me what I have on the board is wrong. So,
thank you.
Okay, so we want to talk, guys, just very quickly, because I don't want to bore everybody to death, but like we want to tell you about a couple of little things. So we are not finished with this. I think I mentioned before, I've worked in a couple of offices where this has happened, and everything from an architecture firm to a co-working space where we took a look at these kinds of things. And the shortest process I ever saw like this took about 24 months. Our team is about 16 months into this work, and we have had some changes on our team and some interruptions, with the pandemic and a little bit of stress with like the election and stuff like that. So it makes it a little bit harder to make these kinds of decisions. But we did realize really early on that implementing stuff quickly and in small kind of defined pieces would help maintain some enthusiasm across the office. It would also help us get some executive buy-in. These things take a lot of time, and when there's a lot of billable work going on, they take away from that sometimes, and getting people's attention and then prioritizing it. If it has already affected the bottom line and you can already see improvements, it's a little bit easier to get people to pay attention to the project. So the first thing that we did, we talked about the handoffs and that we were having some problems between the design team and the dev team and the handoffs. This one is so simple. If you can see these tiny yellow dots that are on this screen, there's one that says 1, and there's a 2, a 3, and a 4, and they're kind of in the sort of in the middle on the interaction timeline. So not a surprise to anyone who has used Zeppelin. We were using their annotation process, and this is how it gets represented. It's not terrible, but it is a little opaque. And there were some things that were getting lost. We also had a numbering system that we were applying to our artboards and how they were getting uploaded that caused some version control issues. We thought it was flexible enough, but it wasn't. And then we kept having some sort of technical issues, and the thing about the intent sort of not being clear enough. So we, through a couple of very direct conversations with our dev team about this, about like, hey, this keeps happening, hey, we're having this problem, how can we solve this? And they just got super clear with us about the stuff is buried inside Zeppelin. It's hard to see, it's hard to follow. There's not a great way to represent this. And we had a couple of junior devs that were struggling more with it than the senior guys were, but that's that place of like, you don't know what you don't know, and so you don't know that you're looking for that. And Bear, who I mentioned earlier, sauntered over to mine and Lisa's desks one day and said, hey, somebody just gave me this awesome set of annotations and I think we need to try it. You can tell they're hot pink. My first thought was, oh my God, that's hideous. But they're super, super clear. We also expanded the artboards so that the notes were directly in the artboard instead of being buried. We have a template that shows how to apply this to a variety of sizes of screens. And in that template, there is a checklist. And again, the notes, the annotations are included in the process from the very beginning. So could this improve significantly? Absolutely. Have 1,000 people done this before us? Yes. Did I feel dumb that we hadn't implemented it this way from the beginning? 100%. Did the lovely John Kay that did my bootcamp class at General Assembly tell me to do it exactly like this? And I totally ignored him when I started at work. But
I didn't know that.
Right? You know, you hear all these great things along the way and you just forget to implement them. But does it work? Yes. We're doing better work because of it, and we will continue to improve as we go. So that was our first sort of tiny project. We're seeing great results from it. The dev team loves it. The design team mostly loves it. I think we still think the hot pink dots are hideous, but you can't miss them, right? The second thing was that we had some things that were happening in the planning stages, even when we were pricing out work and writing SOWs that were not making it all the way through. So there was some intention about like, oh, this is how we want to staff it. This is the person on our team who's the right person for it. This is how we want to structure the work. Some of that was making it through, but not all of it. And then in addition to that, we had some issues when we were looking from one team to another and passing things off and making sure that what people were actually accountable for and then flowing back and forth between different projects was happening in a more structured way. So lots of us were using Kanban boards in different parts of the process. We just decided to formalize it and create a system for the office that said, here's a set of templates for Kanban boards for the office, and this is how we're going to use them. We have just released this. We have some disagreement about our implementation, and so we'll be adjusting some things as we go. But we had some collateral behavioral things that this really supported, and one was we decided to use 3 separate boards, one for PM, one for design, and one for dev. There's also a separate QA process that the client is involved in that happens in the same Trello boards. But we took a minute to explain to people, look, the reason that your board and your PM's board are different is because you need to be in control of an element of the organization of, you know, the design board as a designer. But you are still responsible for looking at those other boards and keeping track of what everybody is doing and knowing when an issue is coming up that the gap in that person's information is actually you. And so you might get tagged on the dev board as, you know, hey, Michelle, here's this card, but at this point in time, I need you to answer this question, or I need you to give me this piece of collateral. The other thing is we started using the checklist feature. I showed you the standardized process that the UX team was using. So the UX team has taken that and created, I think we have a little bit more than 20, less than 25 checklists of, hey, we're doing stakeholder interview prep. It looks exactly the same every time. The results of it might be different. The way the research pans out might be different, but the process is exactly the same. So we have a checklist and we share it with each other, and we kind of go through it like that. Now, not to give the impression that the point of origin of all problems at MaxMedia's office is the design team. Our next project that's coming up has to do with timesheets. And this is, anybody who's worked in an agency, anybody who's tied to the billables, knows that this is always problematic. So our PMs are having a problem calculating the burn rate because time is getting entered in these big chunks when people get ready to do it instead of in a daily drip. But we don't have a set of specific instructions, verbal or written, that say this is what good time entry looks like and this is when it happens. And we don't have that preemptive instruction followed along with a piece of enforcement where there is a specific person who says, other than the CFO, right, who says like, hey, I need your timesheets. And again, this is where the niceness of our team has kind of gotten in our way, because nobody wants to prod anybody for it until they're super desperate to get it or a little bit mad about it, right? And so we're just kind of taking a slightly different approach. There's also a piece of this that I think bubbled up that was super interesting to me, in that when we said, oh, the preemptive instruction coupled with the enforcement, this is a really particular type of activities. Now, a lot of us on the Zoom tonight are designers. Designers are not known for their enforcement personalities. We operate from a really different perspective, but in the conversation between the four of us that were implementing some of these process things, we're all on Zoom, we're all looking at each other and we're talking about, oh, this would be really great if it had an enforcement element to it. This would be really great. And you could see everybody on the call visually squirming, like, oh God, please don't tell me I have to enforce this with other people. This is not who I want to be in my office. But this is a crucial part of the process. And so the PM team said, well, it really should be us, but the two of us are non-enforcers. And so our next hire on the PM team needs to be somebody that they may not be as senior as the people that are in our office right now, and they may not be as organizational necessarily, but they do definitely need to be somebody that has an enforcement personality, and that they want to do that.
Can I just interject that Rachel told me, and I don't want to call you out, Rachel, but you asked me for some kind of asset, a design asset, and you go, okay, I'm going to walk away, but do you need a time frame? And I'm like, well, I'm a designer, so yeah. So yeah. And she goes, how about Friday? And I was like, Friday is great. Like, I don't know what it is, but I'm just like piggybacking on what Michelle's saying. It's like we need PMs that put time frames around projects. If I could just reiterate.
Yeah, and I'm on the admin side. I introduced myself earlier, but yeah, timesheets is a point of contention, admin versus creative at MaxMedia. It's a showdown with timesheets.
It's a showdown.
I don't think that's well, I mean, maybe it's a little different in the enterprise world. I'm not really sure, or maybe it's the quirk of our office, right? Like every office dysfunction is unique. So